Well, welcome everyone to this next session of our conference on inequality today. My name's Tom Cochrane. I'm on the board of the TJRyan Foundation and I'm also from QUT. It's my pleasure to introduce two speakers and what I'll do is say something about them before they start. The first is Dr. Jim Stanford, who's the Director of the Centre for Future Work based at the Australia Institute. Jim served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Uniform, Canada's largest private sector trade union, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He is also the Harold Innes Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University in Canada. Jim has recently been a prominent public commentator on inequality and the future of work in Australia. Professor John Quiggin is an Australian Laureate Fellow in Economics at the University of Queensland. He is prominent as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian economic policy. Professor Quiggin is a Fellow of the Econometric Society as well as the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He's produced over 1,500 publications, including 6 books and more than 200 refereed journal articles in fields including decision theory, environmental economics, production economics, and the theory of economic growth. His book, Zombie Economics: How Dead Ideas Still Walk Among Us, was released in 2010 by Princeton University Press and has been translated into 8 languages. He is a founding board member and research associate of the TJRyan Foundation. The format for this next session will be that Jim will talk to us for about 25 minutes, John will respond for about 10, and then we'll have time for Q&A as before. So without further ado, would you please welcome Jim Stanford.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Lucky you, on this session, you don't just get one economist, you get 2 economists. And keep in mind, an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So hopefully you had coffee at the break there. Tom, thank you and the other organizers for inviting me. It's a long way to Brizzy from my native Canada, as your former Prime Minister called it. And I did note, as I was planning the trip, I checked the weather in Brisbane today, and I saw that it was going to be warmer here today in the middle of your so-called winter than it is at home in Toronto in the middle of our so-called summer. So that's interesting, and a good cause for a glass of wine on that balcony at the end of the day. So for those that don't know, maybe we could call up the PowerPoint here, if that's all right. Thank you. Who don't know about the Centre for Future Work, it's a new initiative under the umbrella of the Australia Institute, and our goal is to become a kind of a centre of excellence on work, employment, fairness, equality, industrial relations, the future of work and jobs, and so on. And it's a brilliant name. I have to give full credit for the name of our centre to Ben Oquist, who's the director of the Australia Institute. I was going to call it the Centre to Ruthlessly Expose the Iniquities of Capitalism. But he thought Centre for Future Work had more appeal, broader appeal, and he's right. And you wouldn't believe how many calls we get just of people who Googled future of work, Centre for Future Work, I'll call them. So that worked out well. Anyways, there's our website. We've published about 20 different reports and briefing notes and so on in our first year, all free access at the website. And there's my Twitter handle and the Centre's Twitter handle. I invite you to join the discussion there. So I'd like to talk about, obviously, the trends in inequality in Australia, and obviously a newcomer to the country, so I don't want to sound too critical, but the reality is, and you all know this, that's why you're here, we're in an awful mess in Australia in terms of the trends in income distribution and what it means for the cohesiveness of our society, but also the effectiveness of our economy. Australia was known as the country where it was a fair go for all, and at one point that was true. Australia was one of the most egalitarian countries in the industrialized world, comparable to Sweden in the 1970s, which is an amazing achievement, and it's been pretty well all downhill since then. Today, Australia has worse than average income inequality. So I like the slogan, a fair go for all, and I know that it has cultural resonance here, and I know that it motivates people to fight for something that's decent. But as a description of reality, it no longer applies and should be banned on grounds of truth in advertising, okay? Australia is not the land of a fair go for all. Australia has worse than average inequality compared to other industrialized countries, and it's getting worse fast. And again, I come from Canada, where we prize the existence of that thin line called the 49th parallel enormously, okay? And we are always congratulating ourselves and getting repetitive strain injury, patting ourselves on the back, saying, oh God, we're better than the Americans anyways. And I have heard that slogan here 142,000 times. At least we're better than the Americans. Guess what? That is not much of a benchmark, okay? And by all kinds of measures, including wealth concentration at the top, tax collections as a share of GDP, program expenditure as a share of GDP, trade union membership as a share of employment, you are frankly not much better than the Americans. The gap between Australia and America is closing fast. And I don't say that to criticize, I say that to call to action. And let's face this challenge and the consequences that are being felt everywhere. The economic costs of inequality, this isn't just about sort of a touchy-feely, caring, sharing kind of argument. This is a hard-headed argument about economic well-being and the future of our economy as well as the society. And there's been all kinds of interesting and powerful research in the last decade from all over the world, from all disciplines, not just economists, about the costs of inequality. And I know that especially these days where someone in Liberal Party strategy room decided this was the moment to rekindle the Cold War, apparently, with all this stuff about the politics of envy and going back to East Berlin, apparently, and other things like that, that if you raise a concern about inequality, you're just envious, right? And I always think of that with the video. Have you ever seen the video of the two monkeys in side-by-side cages, and one gets a banana and the other doesn't, right? And the one that didn't get the banana goes bananas, I guess you could say. And it's actually interesting because it shows that there's a biological process happening. And the more that we understand about the history of the human race and social biology and social anthropology, we actually understand we are hardwired to respect equality. And it isn't just, that I'm envious that monkey went bananas when the one got a banana and the other didn't. It's because since the time humans descended from the trees in East Africa somewhere, our social intelligence and innate capacity to cooperate are in fact what helped us survive as a species and spread over the world, for better or worse, for the planet, okay? It was our ability to perform complex tasks together and negotiate and allow that to happen in a fair and sustainable way that actually is crucial to us surviving as a species. And that goes completely against the Homo economicus bullshit, if I can use that technical term, that people are taught from year one, right, John? Year one in economics, that we're all motivated by individual greed and nothing else. And that's, social anthropologists laugh at that because it's completely inaccurate as a description of where humans came from. So it isn't about envy, it's actually about recognizing that cooperation and some kind of sharing of both the work and the gains of work is essential if this project known as humanity is to continue. So it's not just a personal hardship of people who don't have enough material incomes and goods that's the problem. It's not just the stress and insecurity that their families experience, and we see that big time in Australia today with household debt higher today as a share of incomes and GDP than it was in America in 2007. And if you go back to America in 2007, you know that that wasn't a good position to be in. There's all kinds of evidence, concrete evidence, again, from multiple disciplines about the health, the education, the well-being, criminality, other outcomes. For example, the new science about the study of stress hormones in the blood and the long-term effects on everything from diabetes to heart disease and so on. Stress hormones that are released by being in a situation of chronic inferiority compared to the rest of those around you. And the evidence is very clear on this, that this is harmful for your health. Inequality is harmful for your health, not just because you might be poor. You could actually have a decent, sustainable living standard, but still experience that if you're looking down the street and seeing someone else who's better than you, just like the monkey in the cage next to the one who got the banana. The fiscal costs that come from those damages are enormous as well. Less tax revenue paid because the masses of people aren't getting more incomes, but also the costs of all of the social consequences of inequality, from prisons to hospitals. And now, of course, new evidence about the impact of inequality on macroeconomic performance. In a short-run sense, the fact that the masses of people in Australia are not getting real incomes gains despite their work and their productivity slows down economic growth, because we have a position of chronic inadequacy in purchasing power, and the more income is redistributed to the rich, they try to spend it, believe me, okay, but they don't succeed in spending it all, okay? So the reality is it's a constant drain, both the income going to high-income households and the income that's hoarded by corporations who are taking in more after-tax cash flow than they know what to do with, so they're not reinvesting. So those are a constant drain on purchasing power, but there's a longer-run problem when the link between work and income is broken, as it has been, with productivity growing and real income not growing. There's going to be damage done to the mechanics and the incentives that drive the whole economic system. I want to talk about inequality in the context of work, because I work at the Center for Future Work, so anything to do with work, Google it and you'll come to my center, okay? Inequality is not just about some people having more money than other people, okay? That's kind of a trivial way to look at it. There's structural schisms in society that help to explain what's happening, and those do relate, in my judgment, to how labor markets are working and not working, and I'm going to try and put it in that context. And others have recognized the importance and problems of wages. I know that, say, our treasurer, Scott Morrison, sometimes he's like Mr. Hyde. Wage increases are bad and terrible, and if anyone got a wage increase who's a member of the working class, it will be on the front page of the Australian, showing how terrible that the world is about to end, okay? Except when the budget is being defined, in which case he becomes Dr. Jekyll, and wage increases are good. In fact, here are the wage forecasts based in the last budget, and in order to balance his budget by 2021, at the end of it there, he has to expect total wage payments to be growing by 5.25% a year. So go for it, CFMEU, okay? Then, of course, as if that wasn't upside down enough, we've got a central banker who's urging workers to get to the barricades and demand higher wages, because he's recognizing the damage of wage stagnation. Again, not just for social cohesion and inequality. I don't think it's got quite to the Reserve Bank yet on that score, but at least for economic performance. I mean, honestly, talk about pigs flying. The central banker is usually the one who marches in and takes the punch bowl away, right? This time he's gone there, he's putting extra tequila in the punch, and the party's just getting going. So a way to think about this is in a way to think about inequality in two dimensions. Most commonly, we think about inequality as the gaps in incomes across different households, and there's all kinds of studies about different ways to measure it, their income, their wealth, their consumption possibilities. Different statistical tools to measure it. You know, for the graduate students in the room, you've gone bug-eyed thinking about Gini coefficients and ratios and top income shares. And this is important. It's important to understand how income distribution has shifted between different households. This is one of my favorite measures of it. This is from the great database that was associated with Emmanuel Saez in Berkeley and Thomas Piketty in France, and great people in Australia gathering the Australian data. So this is the share of the top 1% of households in the total personal income of Australia, and there's a giant U-shaped curve there. Now, only Scott Morrison could look at that graph and say inequality isn't rising, okay? Which apparently is his view of it. And I think he must have compared that point to that point, okay? That's the only way you could look at that graph and decide that inequality isn't rising. Of course, in a historic sense, inequality is rising and continues to rise dramatically, although you will have little differences from one year to the next. And in fact, I think of this as one of two incredibly clarifying ways to describe the history of what Sally McManus was talking about just a while ago, the history of neoliberalism. Look at what happened here in World War II. The top income share fell dramatically because suddenly everybody else in the country got put back to work. It bumped back up again for a couple of years right after the war, but then it declined steadily in the face of industrial development, the development of a welfare state, and the institutions of redistribution, and everything that went with it. And so from the perspective of the top 1% of society, this was a disaster. Okay, you had their share of total national income go from, say, 11% before the war to a low of about 4.5% in the late 70s. Now imagine that, the 1% getting only 4.5%, only 4.5 times their fair share of the total income. That's completely unacceptable, obviously. So we had, and this picture was drawn in other countries around the world, we had a deliberate project to turn things around, and that's what Sally called neoliberalism. And it was a whole set of fiscal, monetary, labor market, globalization, regulatory, and social policies that was designed to turn that ship around. And just because they met in a room with the Mont Pelerin Society at some chateau doesn't mean it was a conspiracy, okay? And I've always known that just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not following you, okay? So keep that in mind. And of course, they did turn things around. So starting with Volcker shock in America, the election of Thatcher and Reagan, and all of the spillover from that around the world and in Australia. And it took on a unique character in Australia, didn't it? Because some of those policies were implemented by Labor governments, not all of them, and they were certainly made worse by coalition governments. But it was part of an overall vision of trickle-down economics, enrich the power and freedom of those at the top, and expect the activity unleashed as a result to benefit and lift all boats. That is the logic, and that's still what is claimed. And I think this is actually a telling picture of the reasons for neoliberalism, and certainly the timing of neoliberalism and the end results of neoliberalism, which is rebuilding that share of the plutocracy, if you like, the top 1%, back to near the levels that it would have had before World War II. That's one dimension of inequality. Another way that economists would measure inequality is not across households, but across factors of production. That is to say, the different resources that are used in the economy, and correlate possibly the two between the different groups of households, because the thing about rich people is not just that they have more money. Okay, they do have more money, but they play a different role in society and in the economy by virtue of the nature of the resources that they control, and in particular, the difference between labor and capital and the roles that they play in the economy, and the shifting balance of power between them is a key part of the story behind the first dimension of inequality, which is how income is distributed across households. So this is another graph. This is, if I would argue, the second graph that shows with incredible clarity both the reasons for neoliberalism, the timing of it, and the consequences of it. This measures the share of labor compensation, including wages, salaries, superannuation contributions, and other forms of benefits, as a share of total GDP in Australia. And again, you had in the 50s, this graph only started in 58. This is when the ABS quarterly data began, but you could extend the graph back a little bit further and the trend would still be there. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, you saw a rising share of labor in the total economic pie that was produced, reflecting the growing economic, social, fiscal, and cultural power of workers to demand a fair go. And by the 70s, they had as fair a go as has ever been seen on this planet in Australia. But, again, despite those policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm starting to sound like an oldies goldies disc jockey, aren't I? The greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's been all crap since. Except for the music. The music, of course, was best in the 80s, because that's when I went to college. And everybody's favorite music is when they went to college. Okay. Well, anyway, starting in the late 70s, same time as the previous graph turned around, this one turned around too and has been declining more or less steadily ever since. With the labor share of GDP, there's a cyclical component, because when the economy has a recession, and I know that doesn't happen too often here, but when it does, profits fall faster than wages, so the labor share can rise during times of economic weakness. But that's a bit misleading. You have to kind of look at the long run trend, and it's down. And in fact, this year hit the lowest share since this data was being collected. So I think this picture of the changing factor distribution of income is related to the previous picture of the changing household distribution of income, for the main reason that less money going to labor means more money going somewhere else. And the 11 percentage point decline in labor's share of the GDP that you can see here from the late 70s until now, 11 percentage points, 10 of those 11 percentage points are reflected in an increase in the share of corporate gross surplus, is how it's measured in the national income accounts. Gross surplus of corporations has risen by 10 percentage points of GDP. So it's a straight up redistribution of the pie from labor to capital. And the reason this is reflected in the changing household distribution of income is because wealthy people are wealthy. I went to university for 10 years and got a PhD so that I could come out with statements like that. Wealthy people are wealthy. So the business wealth that is built into their portfolios and their holdings and their ownership and their capital holdings are the ones benefiting from that 10 percentage point increase in the share of capital in GDP. We can go into a little bit more detail if we like about understanding the reasons for the decline. Arithmetically, it's because labor productivity is growing, but labor compensation is not growing, or certainly not growing as quickly. So, labor productivity continues to chug along. It isn't nirvana. We don't have the age of the robots appearing according to labor productivity growth. It's actually been kind of sluggish, if anything, but it's continuing. Real wage growth, on the other hand, has slowed down. Right now it's zero, but even in the medium term, it's been much, much slower, about 1/3 as fast as productivity is growing. So if you're producing more but not being paid more, arithmetically, you're going to have a lower share of the total pie. So labor productivity has been continuing, and this is, again, an immediate refutation for those who say Australia just can't afford to do the things we used to do, back in the 70s. The reality is each hour of labor expended in Australia produces 60% more real value added than it did even in the mid-80s, let alone the mid-70s. So anything we could afford in the mid-70s, we can afford close to times two today, but the compensation is not keeping pace with that, which means a handy little thing that economists call the unit labor cost, which is the share of the total cost of an output, a unit of output, that is destined for the pockets of the workers who produced it, not just in the immediate factory, but in other things down the road, is shrinking. And that has also hit a record low. So when business says Australia is too expensive, workers are too expensive, this is why we have to cut wages and cut entitlements, cut penalty rates. In fact, in recorded history, there's never been a time when workers, relative to their productivity, have been cheaper in Australia today. I don't know what I just did there. Okay, sorry, wrong button. So in terms of the relationship between factor income and household income, this is where we have to talk about the distribution of wealth in society. It's hard to get data on the distribution of wealth for various reasons. First of all, it's so concentrated in a small group of households. It's unlikely, Gina Reinhardt is going to be called when the ABS does their randomized survey of households. And even if by fluke she was called, her minion who answered the phone would probably not come fully transparent on the amount of wealth that was owned there. So the survey methodology misses top incomes. You can also go to administrative data like income tax data that's more reliable. On the other hand, even that's tricky because there's this place called Panama where some of that wealth ends up. Very important when thinking about wealth data to distinguish between financial assets and other assets, in particular, the value of your own home that you happen to live in, okay? I know that by that standard, most Australians are millionaires, okay? But I hate to pop your bubble. The reality is you still need a house over the head, and just because you live in a property boom doesn't make you all millionaires. If you step back from that and actually look at disposable or liquid business wealth that I think is more relevant economically, the concentration is startling, and it's not well known. And if it was well known, I think people would be angrier about it. The top 1% that was getting that share that I talked about probably owns about at least a third of total financial and business wealth. There are 39 billionaires. If you read the rich list that BRW puts out once a year, 39 billionaires in Australia that have 6% of the total financial wealth, 39 people. So that's half the people in this room. So the aisle there, you guys are the billionaires, okay? And you own more wealth than the bottom half of society. More wealth than 12.5 million Australians, which is saying something. And if you decompose the growth in top incomes that I showed you in the first U-shaped graph, the overwhelming increase in wealth is the result of capital incomes. The overwhelming increase in incomes to the wealthy is because of incomes on capital, not because, they got a raise in their job. So I think that helps to tell the story of why we need to address the structural maldistribution of power in our society. What we're seeing today is the result of a multidimensional, deliberate effort that began in the 70s and has been implemented incrementally ever since to enhance the power and freedom and privilege, again, at every step of the way. So the tax system, for example, clearly is biased in favor of income from capital as opposed to income from labor. So you've got partial taxation of capital gains, partial taxation of dividends, negative gearing loopholes, and other advantages that only go to people who own wealth rather than people who work for a living. So the reality is if you flip properties or flip bonds all day, you only pay tax on half of your income. If you flip burgers at McDonald's, okay, you have to count every dollar of income that you made. And this is a systematic effort to use one set of policies, and the same thing happens in other areas of policy to benefit those who have wealth and have benefited from it. Our response to inequality has to recognize those structural factors going on in society and think not just about redistributing income between households, which is an important part of it. So we do have to make the tax system fairer by closing some of those loopholes. We also have to be systematic in redistributing economic power among the different factors in society, because that will give us a better shot at a decent pre-tax distribution of income. And that's what the tax system can then go to work on. And this is where I'm entirely in line with the points that Sally was making earlier about the need to strengthen the institutions of wage determination and income redistribution in our economy. Before the tax man ever shows up, we have to give working households as households and labor as a factor of production a better shot at wresting a share of the pie that they've lost over the last 30 years. And that involves strengthening state-managed labor regulations like the minimum wage and the modern award system, but it also means empowering workers independently through their unions to have a shot at winning wage increases that match or exceed their productivity gains, and thus win back some of the power and some of the wealth that has been shifted the other way. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for inviting me to talk here. Am I okay?
Would you like me to mic you?
No, if this one's working, I'm fine with it.
So then I might mic Jim up.
Sure.
Since we're going to be having this
Jim talked quite a bit about productivity, and I want to tie the links a bit more between productivity and the trickle-down theory, of which we've heard quite a bit, and in which my zombie economics books has a chapter devoting to this particular zombie. And a crucial part of that trickle-down theory is the notion that market incomes reflect productivity, that people work because they want money. The more productive their incomes depend on how productive they are. So if you let them keep more of the income they generate, they'll be more productive and the whole society will go very well. Well, Jim's pointed out this isn't working out very well for workers, hasn't been for some time. There isn't, in aggregate, workers certainly aren't seeing the benefits of the work they get, of their additional productivity in terms of wages. But I'd like to look at the other side of the coin, capital, and make the point that the relationship between capital incomes and productivity has never been weaker than it is at present, or not in the recent past, and that reflects a bunch of things that are going on. The first is that corporate profits are increasingly dependent upon monopoly power of various kinds. Industries globally are more concentrated. A large share of corporate profits are generated by the likes of Macquarie Bank, owning regulated monopoly assets and essentially in the business of gaming regulation with governments. Closely related phenomenon is a very large share of profits arising going to the financial sector rather than to the actual producers of goods and services. And the final point, which Peter hinted at, is the return of inherited wealth as a major source of wealth and income, which means that people with very mediocre abilities and very limited capacity to contribute to society and nonetheless are raking in huge incomes. And of course, the President of the United States is an ideal example of this. Somebody who, while you can't tell his wealth, appears to have barely maintained the value of the wealth he inherited from his father, but nonetheless, of course, is incredibly wealthy and has benefited, in maintaining his wealth at that level, has benefited from all manner of tax arrangements. So that's, I think, from the point, and I think that recognition that recognition reflects, I think, the collapse of faith in the United States, which has happened quite suddenly, I would say, in the space, certainly inside the last 10 years, the collapse of faith in the US in what was called the American dream, the idea that if you worked hard, went to college, studied hard, you could rise from the bottom of the American income distribution to the top. That belief in the US has collapsed. It's reflected, apparently, we heard Peter talking about the middle class. In US focus groups, they've stopped using the term middle class because everybody regards this as a cheat, that they thought they could be middle class, but now they're either struggling to, if they're in the middle class, they're struggling to avoid them and their kids falling out or struggling to climb out of it. That kind of general acceptance has collapsed quite suddenly. So that's, I think, the background, and that's seen, I think, as the facts of inequality have become more evident both in statistical studies like those of Piketty, but also, of course, in lived experience, we are seeing a change. And so now I'd like to come briefly to the defence of ScoMo and Matthias Cormann and say, while it's absurd to suggest that the Labor Party's policies, as they've announced them, are going to take us to Cuba or East Germany, it's perfectly fair of them to say that they're the most left-wing policies put forward by a Labor opposition in several generations. If you take a generation as 15 years, there has at no time in those 3 generations been a Labor government campaigning on increasing taxes. Indeed, we go back to almost the first act of the Hawke government was the so-called trilogy, which promised that taxes and expenditure as a share of GDP would never henceforth increase. So we really have to go back to certainly to the Whitlam government to find any opposition, any Labor opposition or government which has taken a more left-wing position relative to the, of course, easy to do when the state of politics has moved so far to the right, but this is a fair description. And it's striking, and I don't think it's only because Bill Shorten looks so inoffensive on TV. They've done this without any real pushback. The attempts of the Australian and the Cormanns and ScoMos to paint this as some kind of disaster have fallen absolutely flat. Labor's announced policies which have been seen by the so-called hardheads as electoral suicide and remained, the polls don't move much upwards, but they also just roll along with a 3 or 4% lead when Labor says we're going to tax trusts, we're going to reinstate the top income earners levy, and so forth. So I think there is in that a sign for the is in that a very hopeful sign for the way in which politics are going. And certainly, if for your pains you read the Australian when they aren't going on about single-sex marriage or, whatever, when they aren't going on about their various cultural war obsessions, they're writing long lamentations that they have indeed lost the debate over economic policy. And that's, I think, does suggest that there's room to act. I think, as Jim said and as Sally McManus said, that win has already taken place to a significant extent on issues of income redistribution. The idea that we should be redistributing income, that we should be making companies pay more tax rather than less, that high income earners should pay more, has been surprisingly successful. The big issue is the issue of the unfair distribution of market income, essentially generated, as Sally and Jim both said, through the decades of labour market reforms, all of which have reformed labour markets in the interests of employers and against the interests of workers. And I think that's an issue which the politics of need to be addressed carefully. There's no doubt that decades of anti-union propaganda have been effective. On the other hand, what we see, I think, even looking at the local coverage of the bus drivers dispute is suddenly a shift a shift in the direction of not complaints about evil bus drivers stopping people getting home from work, but certainly something which, by the standards of the capitalist media, is far more even-handed than anything we've seen in the recent past. I think the fiasco of the various royal commissions the current government undertook, $100 million spent to essentially zero effect in terms of discovering and prosecuting any criminal behaviour is striking, especially when, as Sally points out, nothing is being spent to stop regular, widely reported and large-scale theft by employers from workers. In the time that commission was running, literally thousands of workers were ripped off by their employers, and these were widely reported. What they found that somebody got a tattoo on the union credit card is the level of criminality that those tens of millions of dollars managed to elicit in terms of prosecutions. So I think the time is right for a shift. We certainly are facing dire threats here, and we have to remember, as was always, as was previously been pointed out, the pull of an alternative explanation, a racist and tribalist explanation being promoted by Trump, by Pauline Hanson, and by large elements of the current government. I think, though, the appeal of the standard neoliberal model has almost completely collapsed, and I think that's the question now is what will replace it. Thank you.
Yes. All right, we've come now to questions and answers, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. So without further ado, who'd like to ask the first question? Right, gentleman here.
Question to Jim. What shape would the graphs take if you had the data and were able to do it? The graphs of the changes in transfer payments in that same period, long time pre-70s through till now. Do you know what shape those graphs would look like?
Hi, by the way. Hi, Laurie.
G'day, how are you?
Good. I didn't give income distribution for all levels. The U-shaped one for the top 1% would include transfer payments, include after tax, after transfer. Transfer payments have grown as a share of GDP and as a share of total income since the 70s and haven't really decreased even under the sort of more strict conservative governments. Although they have for targeted groups. The one group that's been especially targeted for cuts in transfer payments would be working age people, because they're trying to enhance the compulsion to accept whatever you get in the labor market rather than having an alternative out. Transfer payments have been really important in moderating the growth of inequality. They haven't stopped the growth of inequality, but they've been very important, as have the consumption of public services. This is something to keep in mind. The role of government in collecting taxes, hopefully in a progressive way, and it is still a progressive system, a flawed one, but still progressive, distributing some of the money in transfer payments, and then using the rest to pay for public services that are consumed by everyone, by my reckoning, reduces inequality several-fold. So I think it's been very important. I don't know, John, if you have anything to add on that.
No, I think that covers most of what I would have said. So.
All right, a question here, then.
Yeah. You briefly touched on the idea that the neoliberal project was actually a multidimensional systematic effort and across a number of dimensions. And I'd like to, if you could expand on that, because I think to some extent the question about how you unpack it may go to how it was packaged up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in a way, there's also a difference between how it was packaged, as in designed, and how it was sold, in terms of what it was justified as being. Initially, it was justified as a solution to stagflation, right? We were going to get inflation under control with tight monetary policy, independent central banks, inflation targeting, and so on. In fact, the goal was to get workers under control, not inflation, because inflation is under control, and guess what? Things have gotten worse, not better. So I think it was, to some extent deliberate in the sense of recognizing that all the things that happened in the 60s and 70s, including the geopolitical side of things, which we haven't got into, were challenging the hegemony of business leadership in our economy and in our society. And I think it was deliberate and multidimensional in saying we want to roll that back all over. And you can, I think, see monetary policy, fiscal policy, social policy in terms of, trying to recreate this distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, and the undeserving poor get a hard stick kind of approach to social policy. Certainly labor market, what they call labor market deregulation, but of course it isn't deregulation, it's labor market micromanagement with all 800 pages of the Fair Work Act. And the global dimension of it, the financialization would be another piece of it that we haven't talked about, and clearly financialization fits into the growth of high incomes for the top 1%. So I think it is, in a way, from their perspective, a coherent package. And from their goal, which was to reestablish business power and wealth, it's worked. Okay, is it sustainable economically and politically? That's another question, but it's certainly achieved the goal of getting money to the top. It hasn't achieved the trickle-down flourishing of entrepreneurship and growth that they promised, but I don't think that was actually their goal.
Yeah, I mean, as well as financialisation and the attack on unions and attempt with the macro objective of getting wage under control, there's also, I mean, a serious ideological component of a free market critique of all forms of intervention, which, I mean, I think an important point to remember is, I mean, this wasn't a coup launched against a system that was flourishing. We had run into all sorts of difficulties with the breakdown of Bretton Woods, with a labour share that was probably too high, certainly for the system as it too high for the system as it operated to sustain, and with sort of very ad hoc, with a regulatory state which was creaky in all sorts of ways. So it wasn't. First, it wasn't coming out of nothing. There was something real. There was something real to react against, which explains why there was why there's a significant base of popular support and/or acquiescence. What we've seen, I think, is not 100 on the market ideology part, not 100% failure, but clearly movements like privatisation have failed to convince the public that they're beneficial, and have and I think the room is there, and indeed, we're not only, in that sense, not only seeing the most left-wing Labor government in a long time, left-wing Labor opposition in a long time, but we're seeing a Conservative government saying, oh, our solution to the energy crisis is we're going to expand a publicly owned power station, we're going to call corporations in and tell them they should behave better and charge lower prices, we're going to
control gas exports.
Control exports that the previous Labor government allowed to function on market arguments. We're going to give up on waiting for the private sector to build a railway from Melbourne to Brisbane and build it ourselves, and so forth. So I think that critique has lost most of its appeal. There were areas where it's successful, and but overall, the claims made for it are no longer credible. And the other thing is, speaking in the realm of ideas, there haven't been any good new ones for a long time. So in the 70s, there was really, in the 60s and 70s, a really serious intellectual critique coming out of places like Mont Pelerin that had powerful new arguments that sort of refuted the case for interventions that stood in important ways. That really hasn't happened for decades. They're living on fumes. Well, I'd say less so. I would say it's now. I mean, it's the back of the. It's people are now, I think, in a state of confusion. That they sort of know what as with the decline of religion, they sort of know what they're supposed to think, but on the other hand, they're always coming up against stuff that does it. So you see, as I say, this contradiction in the behaviour of the government. But on the one hand, they'll be saying that restricting negative gearing is going to take us back to Cuba, and the next thing saying, oh, by the way, we're going to commandeer gas supplies in order to give cheaper fuel to the people.
Yes.
Well put.
I'd just like to change direction a little bit with my question or comment. I see that why inequality is getting more of a focus is not necessarily because of the reduction in pay to workers and so on like that, but because the price of housing has gone up so much, and that it's going towards a new landlord class through the benefits of the taxation system that we have. And because you're seeing people now, they're giving up being able to own a house because they think that they'll never be able to own it. Possibly the only way they'll ever be able to own a house is if they inherit it off their parents. And that's a major cost in people's living, is if they've got to pay out rent all the time and they're not going to have an asset at the end, which you would have if you were paying a mortgage. So is it something that should be directed in regards to what kind of statistics would be available to show that? Because it certainly hasn't been showing in any statistics so far today.
Maybe I could comment a bit on that. But, I mean, first thing is that this is a very specifically Australian problem because the housing booms that occurred elsewhere collapsed at the time of the global financial crisis. So it's something that's specific to Australia. I think it's important in the sense that we really have a two-level problem of inherited or transmitted wealth. The wealth at the very top, if you look at the list of billionaires, is increasingly dominated, as I say, by mediocre second and third generation types rather than by the people who by hook or by crook built these fortunes. But then within the great mass of the population, you have the shift between essentially families where the parents can afford to put the kids on the housing ladder. Essentially, I think. I'll fess up. We realised this 20 years ago that the only way our kids were going to be able to buy a house is if we came up with a deposit for it, and that's that I think has become increasingly the case, and that's quite a large slab of the population. Probably the top 2 quintiles of the population are now looking at this kind of transmission of housing wealth to their kids while still alive, as a route to get them into home ownership. And then you have still the majority of the population below that, where the parents don't have anything like the kind of resources that can finance a deposit, and where of course the kids have almost no chance of saving it. And the final point is that this is we're building up a crisis. We have for a long while not believed in the crisis of the ageing of Australia, but what we are building up is a crisis in our retirement system, because that retirement system and pension system rests on the assumption that everybody except a small residual class will reach the age of 65 with an owner-occupied house and no mortgage. And what we're seeing, I think, is even among the class who do own a house, the expectation now is you pay off the interest, you never get round to paying off the principal, and people are going to be retiring or reaching retirement age with very large debts that are difficult to handle.
Questions? There's a question down the back there. Sorry. Oh, sorry, you had a question there, did you? Oh, that's okay.
Thanks, guys. Very interesting talk. The relationship, John, that you've mentioned a number of times with politics and economics and the reality on the ground. I mean, your tremendous contribution to the Electrical Trades Union Not For Sale campaign didn't go unnoticed by most, but on the ground, these issues of housing and of costs of energy all come back to politics. And I ask you, and I was going to ask Sally before, in Queensland we've had almost 20 years of Labor, and why haven't Labor done the things that then they came and begged us to rejoin, to go back to what they meant? And they might be just showing some small signs, but the average person on the ground doesn't understand or take in any economic factors at all that we might be looking at here today. Have you got any suggestions about the focus that should take place to amend that?
Yeah, well, although there were some catastrophic failures under those Labor governments, most obviously the Bligh government's push for privatisation, which I remember actually Rachel Nolan had the hide to complain that the ETU was consistently attacking, having attacked her, they turned around and attacked the LNP who replaced her because both of them were supporting privatisation. But so that was, and what we've seen, I think, has been the Labor Party through most of this period has been saturated with this neoliberal ideology, with a better version of it. And I think, again, we should reflect that in important respects we have managed this neoliberal era better than most of the other English-speaking countries. The tax and transfer payments system has been more progressive than any other English-speaking countries, and the Queensland Labor governments have done a good job in some respects for example, moving towards higher quality health and education systems than we inherited from the Bill Peterson era. But they've also essentially gone along with this, with privatisation, with the idea of the national electricity market, with all of these general tendencies. And we're only now, I think, seeing the sway of that sort of stuff breaking. I mean, even a trivial dispute like Buy Queensland versus the Free Trade Agreement says, you can no longer win an argument by saying, well, that's against the free market. They might lose the argument in court, but they're certainly not going to say, well, this is the free market and we have to go with it. So there's a bit of a shift.
If I might ask, the global crash that we attributed as being so fantastic worldwide, and I was working out in the building industry at the time, we would have gone absolutely broke if we didn't have the BER, was it, Building Education Revolution. The money that was spent on that kept the economy going and saved us from the same fate of the rest of the world. But all of the other economic criteria are just sort of nonsense. But Labor never stood up for themselves about that either.
No, that was a major failure. That Labor should have run hard on that. Instead essentially they capitulated.
Right, last question. Yeah, young.
It seems to me that the response to the current economic downturn is cheap money to the private sector. I'm just wondering whether that would, and it seems to me that increases inequality rather than decrease it. I'm just wondering what response you have to that.
Cheap money is certainly there and it's likely to stay. I suppose the question then is, well, who's going to borrow that money and spend it? And I suppose the argument increasingly we're seeing, I guess, in terms of infrastructure that governments are more willing to say, look, rather than pay 6% to a private sector firm for this, we'll borrow 2% and build the thing ourselves. So I guess I see a potential positive there. But obviously, as I was saying before, there's this incredibly mixed picture where the same person will one day get up and say, we're going to build this nation-building railway, and the private sector's only going to get a little tunnel at the end, and the next day say, tightening up tax rules on trusts is the first step towards the gulag. I mean, it's sort of, and that just reflects, I guess, the fact that we are in a very incoherent position.
There's another way in the monetary policy realm where John's point about neoliberalism's credibility crumbling is very evident, and that would be the breakdown of the consensus around inflation targeting being the one and only thing that central banks are supposed to do, and once they do it well, everything else will take care of itself. And that idea is in complete tatters. And now you've had, not in Australia, but in most of the world, the adoption of very unconventional and very non-neoliberal monetary policies that really, in a way, let the genie out of the bottle. Once you admit that, the central bank's going to have to create money out of thin air, in the same way private banks do every day, by the way. But we're going to let the central bank do it because we don't know what else to do to get the economy going. But then you can really ask questions, well, if we can do that, who's going to get the money and what are we going to do with it? And again, it's where I think there's an opportunity for a very powerful alternative vision of how to move forward.
Right, and on that note, hopefully, a little bit of moving forward occasionally. Thank you very much, gentlemen.